The Willowbrook Hepatitis Study, Science Behind Locked Doors. You are a parent. Your child has an intellectual disability, significant enough that they require care beyond what you can provide at home. You have searched, waited, applied, appealed, and finally, after months of uncertainty, you receive word that a place has opened up at the Willowbrook State School on Staten Island, New York. A state institution, government-funded, staffed by professionals, a place where your child will be safe, cared for, educated. You exhale for the first time in months. Then a staff member sits across from you and explains that, unfortunately, there is a problem. The general wards are currently full. There are no available spaces. Your child cannot be admitted, unless you agree to enroll them in the research unit. It is a separate wing of the facility, slightly smaller. Your child will receive the same food, the same shelter, the same basic care. The only difference is that they will be participating in a medical research study. You ask what the study involves? You are told that your child will be given a controlled dose of the hepatitis virus, deliberately, intentionally, under medical supervision, so that researchers can observe how the disease progresses and test whether any treatments are effective. You are a parent who has run out of options. The general ward is full. The research unit has space. And you are sitting across from a doctor in a state institution holding a form. What do? Hundreds of parents over nearly 15 years signed that form. Not because they wanted their children infected with hepatitis, but because the alternative was no care at all. And a form signed under those circumstances is not consent. It is coercion wearing consent's clothing. This is the story of Willowbrook. And it is one of the most important, most shameful, and most consequential stories in the entire history of medical ethics. Welcome back to the darkest experiments. We began Chapter 3 with little Albert, a 9-month-old infant conditioned to fear the world by researchers who then walked away without undoing what they had done. We moved to the monster study, where orphaned children were told their voices were broken and carried that wound in silence for the rest of their lives. Now we arrive at the final experiment in Chapter 3. And in terms of scale, duration, and the systematic nature of the ethical violations involved, it is the largest of the three. Willowbrook lasted nearly 15 years. It involved hundreds of children. It was government-funded, institutionally sanctioned, and defended, vigorously and publicly, by the researchers who ran it. It was not hidden in a filing cabinet like the monster study. It was published in medical journals. It was presented at conferences. That is what makes it so important to understand. The Willowbrook State School opened in 1947 on Staten Island, New York. It was designed to house approximately 4,000 children and adults with intellectual disabilities, what was then referred to in the clinical language of the era as mental retardation. By the 1960s, it held over 6,000 residents. It was grotesquely, dangerously overcrowded, understaffed, underfunded, a place where the gap between the institution's stated purpose, care, education, dignity, and the lived reality of its residents was measured not in inches, but in miles. In conditions of that kind of overcrowding, disease spreads with terrible efficiency. Hepatitis, a viral infection of the liver, capable of causing severe illness and long-term organ damage, was endemic at Willowbrook. It moved through the institution constantly, infecting nearly every new resident within months of arrival. The staff knew it. The administration knew it. The state knew it. Into this environment came Dr. Saul Krugman, a respected infectious disease researcher from New York University. Krugman had a genuine scientific interest in hepatitis, its causes, its progression, and its potential treatment. And in Willowbrook, he saw something that presented in his framing a research opportunity. His reasoning, which he stated openly and defended until the end of his career, was something like this. The children at Willowbrook were going to contract hepatitis anyway. The conditions of the institution made infection virtually inevitable. If they were going to be infected regardless, was it not better, for science and ultimately for humanity, to infect them in a controlled, monitored, medically supervised way, and use that process to generate knowledge that might one day help millions of people? It is a seductive argument. It is also a deeply flawed one. And understanding precisely why it is flawed is one of the most important ethical lessons in this entire series. Beginning in 1956, Krugman and his colleagues admitted selected newly arrived children, many of them very young, some just toddlers, to the research unit at Willowbrook. There, under medical supervision, they were deliberately fed or injected with live hepatitis virus extracted from the stool of infected residents. The researchers then monitored the children's progression through the disease, tracking their symptoms, their liver function, their immune response. Over time, Krugman used the study to distinguish between two strains of hepatitis, what we now call hepatitis A and hepatitis B, a genuine scientific contribution that has had lasting value for medicine. He also tested a form of passive immunization using gamma globulin, finding that it could provide temporary protection. Again, genuinely useful knowledge. But let us be precise about what produced that knowledge. It was produced by infecting children who could not consent in an institution they could not leave, at the direction of adults they could not question, with the agreement of parents who had been placed in a position where refusal meant their child received no care at all. The consent forms that parents signed described the study in language that emphasized its potential benefits and minimized, or omitted entirely, the nature and severity of what was being done. Parents were told their children would be given the hepatitis virus in as small a dose as possible. They were not told, clearly and plainly, that their toddler was about to be deliberately made ill with a disease that attacks the liver, causes jaundice, fatigue, nausea, and in some cases, permanent organ damage. And the admission policy, the practice of telling parents that the general ward was full while the research unit had space, was not an accident or an oversight. It was a mechanism. It ensured a steady supply of new subjects by making participation the path of least resistance for parents who had already exhausted every other option. That is not a gray area. That is the engineering of coercion. Krugman and his supporters offered several defenses of the Willowbrook study, and it is worth engaging with them honestly, because they are not entirely without logic, and understanding where they fail is more useful than simply dismissing them. The first defense, the children were going to get hepatitis anyway. This is probably true, given the conditions at Willowbrook. But the fact that harm is likely does not grant researchers the right to be the ones who cause it. A child who contracts hepatitis from their environment is the victim of overcrowded, underfunded institutions. A child who is deliberately given hepatitis by a doctor is the victim of that doctor's choices. The distinction matters enormously. The second defense, the children in the research unit received better care than those in the general wards. This appears to have been true. Smaller unit, more attentive monitoring, better staffed. But this argument is circular. It says, in essence, we offered better conditions to the children we infected. The improvement in conditions was only necessary because the infection had been deliberately caused. You cannot justify the harm by pointing to the care you provided in response to it. The third defense, the research produced real, lasting medical benefit. This is unambiguously true. Krugman's work on hepatitis A and B contributed meaningfully to virology, and the later development of the hepatitis B vaccine built on a foundation that included his findings. But the history of medical ethics is very clear on this point. The value of knowledge gained does not retroactively justify the means used to obtain it. If it did, the Nuremberg Code would have no meaning whatsoever. The Willowbrook study began attracting serious public criticism in the late 1960s and early 1970s, as the broader disability rights movement gained momentum, and journalists began investigating conditions at state institutions across the country. In 1972, a young television journalist named Geraldo Rivera obtained footage from inside Willowbrook's general wards, footage that showed children lying unattended on the floor, covered in their own waste, rocking in silence, receiving virtually no care or human contact. The broadcast was watched by millions of people and produced a wave of public outrage that fundamentally changed the national conversation about how America treated its most vulnerable citizens. The resulting litigation, New York State Association for Retarded Children v. Carey, led to a landmark consent decree in 1975 mandating the depopulation and eventual closure of Willowbrook. The school finally closed in 1987. The hepatitis study itself became one of the central case studies in the development of modern bioethics. When the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research produced the Belmont Report in 1979, the foundational document of modern research ethics in the United States, the Willowbrook study was among the specific cases its authors had in mind. The principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice that the Belmont Report enshrined were written in part as a direct response to what happened in that research unit on Staten Island. The children of Willowbrook, in other words, did not die in obscurity. Their suffering became the moral foundation on which modern protections for research subjects are built. That is a heavy kind of legacy, but it is a real one. There is something important to sit with here that goes beyond the specifics of the hepatitis study. Willowbrook was not an anomaly. It was a symptom. The overcrowding, the neglect, the dehumanizing conditions of the general wards, these were not the result of individual cruelty. They were the result of a society that had decided, collectively and without much deliberation, that people with intellectual disabilities were not quite fully people, that they could be warehoused, that their suffering was a management problem rather than a moral one, that institutions built to contain them were adequate substitutes for the communities, families, and individual dignity that every human being requires. Krugman's study did not create that environment. It found it and used it. And that distinction, while real, does not fully absolve the researchers, because choosing to conduct research in an environment of institutional abuse, rather than using one's platform and expertise to expose and challenge that abuse, is itself a moral choice. The children in the research unit were not the only children being harmed at Willowbrook. They were simply the ones whose harm was being documented. The Willowbrook story carries several lessons, and I want to name them clearly because they are not just historical. They are alive in the world today. The first lesson is about the engineering of consent. When a system is designed so that agreement is the only realistic option. When saying no means your child receives no care, your patient gets no treatment, your community gets no resource. The consent obtained by that system is not real consent. It is compliance produced by the removal of alternatives. Recognizing this pattern in medicine, in employment, in any institution that holds power over vulnerable people is one of the most important critical thinking skills a person can develop. The second lesson is about what happens when we categorize human beings as less than fully human. The children at Willowbrook were invisible to most of society, filed away in a state institution out of sight and out of mind, until a journalist with a camera walked through the door. That invisibility was not accidental. It was structural. It was what allowed the conditions at Willowbrook to persist for decades and what allowed research of this kind to continue without serious public challenge. The third lesson is about the relationship between knowledge and ethics. Krugman's study produced real knowledge. That is true and it matters, but the pursuit of knowledge is not a moral blank check. Every piece of information has a cost, and part of being an ethical scientist, an ethical human being, is being willing to ask whether the cost is one you are actually authorized to impose. Krugman imposed a cost on children who could not refuse him. That is the line he crossed, and no amount of useful data changes that. The Willowbrook State School is gone. The building was converted into a college campus, the College of Staten Island. And most of the physical traces of what happened there have been absorbed into the ordinary life of an educational institution, but the ethical traces remain. They are embedded in every informed consent form signed before a medical procedure. They are embedded in every institutional review board that evaluates a research proposal. They are embedded in the Belmont Report and in every policy document that followed it. Those protections exist because children were infected with hepatitis in a research unit on Staten Island, and because the world eventually looked at what had happened and said, never again. That closes Chapter 3, the darkest chapter we have visited so far. We have been with little Albert, with the orphaned children of Iowa, and with the residents of Willowbrook. We have sat with the question of what it means to betray the trust of a child. And we have found that the answer carries implications that reach far beyond research laboratories, into every relationship, every institution, and every system that holds power over those who cannot protect themselves. In Chapter 4, we leave childhood behind and step into the territory of groups, of tribes, of belonging, of what happens when ordinary people are sorted into categories and given permission to treat each other as enemies. We begin with a summer camp in Oklahoma, where 22 boys are about to discover how quickly friendship curdles into war. That is the Robbers Cave experiment, and it is waiting for you in the next video. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Leave a comment. Tell me which experiment in Chapter 3 affected you most and why. These conversations matter more than you know, and thank you genuinely for being here for this one. I'll see you in the next one.